Jonas Carr woke up before the sun, the way he had every day for the past 18 years. The wind murmured through the warped window panes of the old ranch house, carrying with it the dusty scent of the dry plains and the faint creak of barnwood settling in the dawn chill. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he stood, the familiar sound echoing in the empty space around him. The house, once filled with life and warmth, now only answered him with silence. He didn't speak as he dressed. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Not since he passed Hank at the feed store on Monday and offered a single nod in place of conversation. Jonas didn't see the point in filling the air with words that wouldn't change a thing. The house was still too big, too quiet, and too full of memories that clung to the corners like spider webs. The coffee percolator groaned on the stove as he stared out the window. The land stretched endlessly before him. His land. Dry grasslands rolling toward the mountains like waves frozen in time. Cattle grazed in the distance, dull specks against the amber morning. The fence along the southern border needed mending. The water trough needed cleaning. The barn door groaned on its hinges again. He made a mental list as he sipped his coffee, black and scalding. It was easier to think in lists. Things to do, problems to fix, routines to follow. It kept the past at bay, kept her face from drifting into his mind when he wasn't ready. But still, sometimes, like now in the stillness of early morning, her laughter would find its way back into his thoughts. He had loved her fiercely. Martha had been the flame in his quiet world. She filled this very kitchen with the smell of cinnamon, and her voice with Sunday hymns. She brought him balance, anchored him to something gentler than the grit of cattle and barbed wire. Her illness had been swift, cruel, and relentless. Cancer had hollowed her out like a wind-carved canyon, and when she was gone, the house collapsed inward on itself, emotionally, if not physically. He hadn't brought himself to change a single picture on the walls. Her coat still hung by the door. Her boots sat neatly by the bench where she used to wait for him to come in for dinner. Time hadn't healed. It had simply dulled everything around him, like dust settling over a painting. Jonas drained the last of his coffee and grabbed his hat. He stepped outside, the morning light just cresting over the hills, painting the land in gold and shadow. His dog, Rufus, trotted up beside him, tongue-lolling, tail wagging out of habit, more than excitement. Even Rufus had grown old with him. By mid-morning, Jonas had repaired 2 fence posts and cleared out the clogged water pump by the north paddock. He moved slow, but steady. His body still obeyed him, even if his soul had long since surrendered to solitude. It wasn't that he disliked people, he just didn't have the energy for them anymore. Their noise, their needs, their chatter. It was like trying to light a fire in the wind. He preferred the quiet work, the tasks that demanded his hands and spared his heart. Around noon, he hitched up the truck and headed into town for supplies. He didn't go often, once a week at most. But when he did, he kept it quick. The grocery store, the feed store, sometimes the post office. He didn't linger. Town had changed too. It had grown a little, filled with faces he didn't recognize, and a rhythm that felt foreign. The old diner had shut down. The school had a new building. The church bell still rang on Sundays, but Jonas hadn't stepped inside in years. He parked near the general store and stepped out, squinting against the sun. He was just about to cross the street when he heard a voice, soft, firm, and threaded with desperation. "I can clean, anything. I just need a job. Please, I can cook too." He turned instinctively, eyes narrowing. A woman stood outside the hardware store, clutching the hand of a small child and speaking to the store manager, who looked vaguely uncomfortable. She wore a faded dress, dusty boots, and her hair was tied back hastily. Her face was tired, creased with stress rather than age, and her voice trembled slightly at the edge. "I'm sorry," the manager said, already retreating inside. "We're fully staffed." The door closed behind him with a final thunk. The woman stood still, her child's small fingers curled around hers. Jonas watched her for a moment. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just nodded once, tight-lipped, and turned to walk away. He didn't mean to speak, but the words slipped out, rough and unfamiliar on his tongue. You looking for work?" She stopped, startled, and turned toward him. Her eyes were striking, not bright, but deep, like still water that ran too far down to measure. "Yes," she said. "Anything, really." "You clean barns?" She blinked. "Yes, sir, I can." He nodded slowly, measuring her. "I've got one that could use it. Not much, but it's honest work. Once a week. Cash. Interested?" She nodded instantly. "Yes, thank you." He pulled a worn card from his wallet and scribbled his address on the back. "Out by Miller's Bluff. Car Ranch. Come by tomorrow morning. You'll know it when you see it." She took the card, gripping it like it might disappear. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked into the store. That night, as he stood on the porch and looked out at the endless stars, Jonas found himself thinking about the woman again. Her voice, the way she held that child close, the quiet strength in her tired face. He didn't know her name, didn't ask. But something about her stirred an old ache he thought had been buried with Martha. The wind whispered across the fields, tugging gently at the eaves. Rufus lay at his feet, snoring. The stars blinked like secrets waiting to be told. And for the first time in a very long time, Jonas Carr felt something unfamiliar brushing at the edges of his soul. A flicker. A beginning. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it wasn't silence. It was the sound of something waking up. She showed up just after sunrise, the sky still painted in soft streaks of gold and gray. Jonas saw her through the kitchen window as he stirred a pot of coffee. She was walking. No truck, no car, just her feet crunching over the gravel path that led to his barn. Her dress was the same as yesterday, or maybe just similarly worn. Her hair was pulled back in a neater braid this time, and her shoulders carried a quiet kind of determination, the kind that came from not having any other option. She stopped a few paces from the barn and looked around like she was making sure she was in the right place. Jonas stepped out onto the porch with his mug in hand and called out to her. "You're early." She gave a polite nod. "I figured early was better than late." He walked toward her, boots thudding against the earth, the dog trailing behind him at a lazy pace. "You walk here?" "Yes, sir." "From where?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the road. "Cabin just past the creek bend. Old log place with a tin roof." Jonas frowned. That was nearly 3 miles. He hadn't even realized someone was living there. It had been empty for years, a half-collapsed hunting lodge with a porch that looked like it might give way if you breathed too hard on it. "You live out there?" She gave a small nod, then looked toward the barn. "Where would you like me to start?" Jonas didn't press. Not yet. He led her toward the barn, explaining what needed to be done as they walked. There wasn't much. Sweeping, cleaning the stalls, checking for old nails in the floorboards, maybe reorganizing some of the hay bales. He paid attention to how she listened, focused, quiet, but not timid. Her eyes scanned the space with practiced efficiency, and she asked no questions. He left her there with a broom and a worn pair of gloves, promising to check back before lunch. He returned to his fencing work, but the rhythm of his morning had shifted. He kept glancing back toward the barn, wondering if she'd stop and rest, if she'd leave without notice, if she'd bring that child again. But she didn't leave. She worked steadily through the morning, kicking up dust and pulling old rope from corners. When Jonas returned just before noon, she'd already cleared out half the barn. "Break time," he called. She turned, wiping sweat from her forehead with the sleeve of her arm. "I'm all right. You've been at it for 4 hours. Come get some water at least." She hesitated, but followed him toward the house. He poured her a glass from the pump outside and leaned against the porch railing as she drank. She sipped slowly, eyes on the horizon. "I never caught your name," he said. "Emily. Emily Harper." "Jonas Carr." She nodded once, polite. Then silence settled between them again. "You got family out here?" he asked. "No, sir." "Friends?" She shook her head. "Just moved in?" Another nod. Jonas waited, hoping she might offer more, but she didn't. Just finished her water, handed him the empty glass, and thanked him before returning to the barn. He watched her go. She walked with purpose, but not pride. Every step was the step of someone who had walked too far for too long. That evening, after she left, he found himself walking the long path past the creek bend. The cabin she'd mentioned was tucked back under a low ridge of trees half hidden by brush. It looked worse than he remembered. Shingles missing, porch sagging, chimney leaning like it might fall in the next good storm. Smoke curled weakly from the rusted stovepipe. He kept his distance, standing behind a cluster of scrub oak. He didn't see her, but he saw movement through the curtainless windows, small shadows flitting through the rooms. Then a sudden sound, laughter. It rang out quick and clear like a bell in the dusk. A child's laughter, maybe two. Jonas stood still, rooted. Laughter wasn't something he'd heard in a long time. Not at his ranch, not in his house. He thought of the silence that filled his rooms, the cold echo of his boots on the wood floor, the untouched table set for one. He turned and walked back before he was noticed, but the sound followed him all the way home. Over the next few weeks, Emily came every Tuesday, just as the sun broke over the ridge. She never missed a day, never came late. Each time, she walked. Each time, she worked without complaint. Jonas started leaving out food and water before she arrived. Sandwiches, biscuits, a thermos of tea. She never said thank you with words, but the empty plate said enough. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them grew less hollow. One day she asked where he kept the extra nails. Another day she laughed. Just once, a short, breathy chuckle when Rufus tried to steal her glove. Jonas felt that laugh like a spark in dry tinder. One morning, a storm rolled in early. Thunder grumbled low in the distance, and the sky turned the color of old bruises. Jonas saw her approaching, shoulders hunched against the wind, one hand wrapped tightly around the wrist of a small boy. The boy looked about 5. Pale, with wild brown curls and sharp eyes, he clung to her dress as she approached. "Sorry," she said, her voice tense. "He was sick. I couldn't leave him." Jonas nodded and held the door open to the barn. She hesitated. "You can work from the house today," he said. "Storm's gonna hit hard." "I don't want. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a dry roof." She looked down at the boy, then nodded once. Inside, Jonas made tea and dug out an old quilt from the hall closet. The boy coughed and curled up on the couch without a word. Emily stood in the doorway like she didn't belong. "You can sit," Jonas said. She did, cautiously, hands folded tight in her lap. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He just sat with her, letting the storm fill the silence. Rain beat against the windows. Wind howled under the eaves. The boy fell asleep. She spoke without warning, voice barely louder than the thunder. "There's 6 of them. My children." Jonas nodded. "I didn't plan to have 6, but I love them. They're all I have." He waited. "My husband left after the last one was born. Said he couldn't take the noise. Said I made him feel like a prisoner." Jonas stared at the fire. "I don't blame him, not anymore. But I had nowhere to go. I took what we had, packed it into a wagon, and followed the road." "You picked a hard place to stop," Jonas said softly. "I picked the first place no one looked twice when I passed by." That silence stretched again, but now it was full of something different. Understanding. A quiet bond between 2 people who had lost more than they cared to admit. After the storm passed, she thanked him again and left, carrying the boy on her hip, his little arms wrapped around her neck. Jonas stood in the doorway long after they were gone, watching the road wind into the trees. He didn't sleep well that night. Kept thinking of that broken cabin and the laughter he'd heard. Of 6 children with no one else in the world but their mother. Of a woman who showed up without complaint, cleaned his barn with bruised hands, and still carried herself with the dignity of a queen. The next morning, he packed a crate with food, flour, beans, canned fruit, coffee, jerky, and left it on the porch of the cabin. No note, just supplies. He told himself it was just a kindness, but when he turned and saw one of the little girls peeking out the window with wide eyes and a cautious smile, something in his chest ached in a way it hadn't in years. And when he heard her voice call gently from inside, "Don't touch it, sweetie, not until we say grace," he stood there just a moment longer, letting the wind press cold against his face before turning back toward the ranch. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like loneliness. And for the first time, he didn't want to carry it alone anymore. Jonas heard them before he saw them. It was the sound of clumsy footsteps on gravel, little feet stumbling over stones, followed by soft shushing from a mother's voice. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw them walking toward the barn, the same dirt path, but today, Emily wasn't alone. The boy from before walked beside her, holding her hand, and trailing behind were 3 more children. A girl with pigtails and a defiant tilt to her chin, another boy with a tear in his shirt and dirt on his cheek, and a tiny girl, barely walking, clutching a stick like it was a sword. Jonas stepped down off the porch slowly. Emily looked tired, more than tired, drained, as if the wind itself had worn her thin. "I didn't have anyone to watch them today," she said quickly, her voice sharp with apology. "I'll keep them out of the way." Jonas looked at the children. They stared back, silent but curious. "They can stay," he said simply, "as long as they don't chase Rufus or stick their fingers in the feed bins." The boy smiled. The girl with the pigtails narrowed her eyes, testing his tone, trying to figure out if he was teasing. Jonas wasn't sure himself. Emily exhaled and her shoulders eased just slightly. She gave a nod and ushered the kids toward a shaded patch of grass near the barn wall. Jonas watched her sweep the barn, her motion stiff and slower than usual. She had a limp in her right leg today. Something small, maybe a pulled muscle, but it made him notice how thin she'd gotten. "You eaten today?" he asked, his voice low as he stepped beside her. "I'm fine," she answered. That wasn't the question. She glanced at him. "There's always enough for the kids." That silence again, that heavy, stubborn silence that held more than any words could. Jonas didn't argue. He walked back to the house, filled a basket with biscuits, jerky, cheese, and apples. He brought it out and set it near the children. They hesitated, like wild animals before a trap. "Go on," he said. "I don't poison children." The boy with the torn shirt moved first, grabbing an apple and offering it to the smallest girl. Soon the others followed, and the moment their hands touched the food, the spell broke. They laughed, talked, passed things back and forth like they hadn't eaten real food in days. Jonas watched them from a few steps away, something tightening in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Emily stood near the door, her back straight, her eyes a little glassy. "They're good kids," she said quietly. "I can see that. I'm doing my best. I know it doesn't look like much, but I keep them clean, I teach them what I can, You don't have to explain yourself to me." She turned her head, surprised. "I didn't bring them for sympathy," she said, suddenly defensive. "I know. They're not a burden. They're my world." I didn't say otherwise. But he could see it. How hard she fought to hold her chin up, to look him in the eye and keep her pride intact. It wasn't defiance. It was survival. That night he walked past the barn again and down to the creek. The moon hung low, swollen and golden, and the trees whispered overhead. The trail was darker here, shaded by thick branches and brush, but he knew the way by heart now. He paused at the edge of the clearing, where the cabin stood slouched in the dark like an old man waiting for sunrise. He didn't approach. He just stood there, listening. Laughter again, muffled words. A lullaby, a squeal, a hush. Emily's voice rising and falling like wind through tall grass. Jonas turned and walked back slowly. A few days later, he found one of the boys, Ben, the middle child, trying to fix a fence panel near the goat pen. He wasn't doing a bad job, but he was using the wrong nails and a stick instead of a hammer. Jonas crouched beside him and held out a real hammer. Try this." Ben looked up, startled. "Am I not supposed to be here?" "You're already here. Might as well do it right." They worked together for the next hour. The boy was smart, quick with his hands, and quicker with his questions. Jonas answered the ones he could. "Where do the goats sleep? Why do cows have 4 stomachs? Can you milk a horse?" Jonas chuckled at that last one and said he was welcome to try, but he wouldn't recommend it. Ben started showing up more after that. Then, the girl with pigtails, Sadie, started helping Emily sweep the barn. The smallest one, Lottie, insisted on brushing Rufus, even though the dog barely tolerated it. Emily apologized every time, but Jonas just waved her off. "They're not hurting anything. They're taking over your ranch. Not the worst thing that's happened to it." One afternoon, Jonas invited them all into the house for supper. Emily froze in the doorway. "I appreciate the offer, but it's just stew." She bit her lip. "The kids could use a hot meal," he added, gentler this time. She looked down at the children. They were already peeking inside, eyes wide at the idea of a table, plates, a warm stove. "All right," she said, "just this once." The table creaked under the weight of mismatched dishes. Jonas hadn't used more than one plate in years. He found old silverware, chipped bowls, even pulled out Martha's cast-iron Dutch oven. They sat awkwardly at first. The kids didn't know if they should speak, or ask, or wait. Jonas passed the breadbasket and said, "You eat like you work, fast and steady." That broke the ice. Soon, the room filled with chatter. Forks scraping, laughter bouncing off the walls. Lottie knocked over a glass and cried, but Jonas cleaned it up without a word and handed her a new one. Sadie told a story about a frog in her shoe. Ben asked if Jonas had ever ridden a bull. Emily sat at the end of the table, watching it all, silent tears in her eyes. Afterward, when the children fell asleep on the couch and floor with full bellies and warm blankets, Jonas made tea for 2. "You didn't have to do this," Emily said. "I wanted to." "It's not your responsibility." He didn't answer right away. "I used to sit at that table every night," he said. "Just me and Martha. She'd talk about the neighbors, the hens, the weather, everything and nothing. After she passed, I didn't sit there again. Not until tonight." Emily looked down into her tea. "I'm not trying to replace her. I know. I don't need saving. I know that too." She looked up then, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. There was no fear there, no doubt, just tired honesty. They need a roof that doesn't leak, boots that fit, a school that doesn't ask questions. "I can fix the roof," Jonas said, "and I've got boots. Too many of them." She laughed, soft and short. The days rolled into weeks, and soon Jonas found himself planning for their visits. He stocked extra food. He cleared out the old chicken coop to make room for a play area. He taught the older boys how to repair tools and showed Sadie how to groom the horses. The ranch, once silent, now buzzed with life. Emily worked beside him every step, never slacking, never asking for more than what she earned. But she smiled more. The lines on her face softened. Her limp faded. The children called him Mr. Carr at first, then Jonas, and finally Pa, though only when they thought he couldn't hear. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, Jonas stood with Emily at the edge of the field. The kids ran wild in the grass, chasing each other, laughing. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. "All the time," she admitted. "Then I remember there's nowhere else to go." "There's here." She looked at him. "I don't mean the barn," he said. "I mean here. This ranch. This house." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. And in that silence, a new kind of understanding was born. It wasn't pity, it wasn't rescue. It was something stronger, rooted, real. A storm was coming. They both felt it in their bones. But for now, there was peace, and laughter, and warmth, and the sound of 6 children breathing life into the heart of a man who once believed he had none left to give. It started with a knock at the door that didn't belong. Jonas had just finished setting the table for supper, bowls of stew steaming in the lantern-lit kitchen, when the sharp, sudden sound cut through the chatter of children and clinking silverware. He paused, eyes narrowing. Nobody knocked on his door anymore. Not since Martha passed. Not since he stopped going to church, stopped showing up for town fairs and potlucks, stopped making the effort. Emily, who had just stepped into the hallway to wash Sadie's scraped knee, looked up sharply. Jonas caught her eyes, a flicker of something passing between them. Fear. He moved to the door and opened it, slow, wide shoulders blocking the inside view. On the porch stood a tall, thin woman in a stiff blazer and dusty heels. She held a leather-bound folder clutched tight to her chest and a plastic badge that hung around her neck like a warning bell. Behind her stood Clara Mayfield, the town's queen of whispers, with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Carr," the woman said, "I'm Diana Ellis. Department of Family Services." Jonas didn't move. "You're here late. We received an anonymous concern about children living in hazardous conditions under your roof. I'm here to investigate the welfare of the minors involved." Clara gave a dramatic sniff behind her. So sad, really. Just wanted to make sure everything is appropriate. Jonas didn't invite them in. Instead, he stepped fully outside and closed the door behind him. Rufus padded silently to his side, hackles lifted just slightly. "You don't have a warrant." Ms. Ellis lifted her chin. "I don't need one to observe and ask questions. If I find cause for concern, we can escalate." "Concern based on what? Children eating hot meals? Learning how to muck stalls and repair fences? Is that the crime now?" Clara crossed her arms, shifting her weight with false sympathy. "Now, Jonas, don't be like that. You know people talk." Jonas leaned forward, his voice low and even. "No, Clara, you talk. And you hate it when people find happiness outside your little web of gossip." Ms. Ellis cleared her throat. "Sir, I just need to verify living conditions and safety. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." From behind the door came the sound of Sadie laughing, high-pitched, carefree. Then a crash. Then Lottie shouting something about Gravy being on her toes. Jonas closed his eyes for a second and drew a breath. "You got 5 minutes," he said. "Then you get off my land." Ms. Ellis stepped inside, clipboard in hand. Clara moved to follow, but Jonas held out an arm like a gate. "Not you, but you step foot in my home uninvited, and I swear I'll put your name on the gate like a stray coyote warning." She turned red and huffed, retreating to her car. Jonas followed the social worker in, tension bristling in every line of his frame. Emily stood in the hallway, arms crossed, her entire body pulled taut like a rope under too much weight. The children had gone quiet. Ben stood near the table, fork still in his hand, watching the stranger with a guarded look that didn't belong in a child's eyes. Ms. Ellis offered a smile that tried too hard. "Good evening. You must be Ms. Harper. I'd like to ask you and the children a few questions." Emily didn't answer. Her eyes flicked to Jonas, then back. He nodded once. "Go ahead." The next 20 minutes stretched like hours. Ms. Ellis asked questions in that careful clinical tone. "Do you feel safe here? Do you sleep indoors every night? Do you get meals every day? Do you attend school?" "Lasiwa." The children answered cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Ben told her how Jonas let him ride the tractor last week. Sadie said she'd learned how to brush down a mare. Lottie showed her a drawing she made of the barn, all crooked lines and flowers as big as goats. Jonas watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. Emily stood behind the children like a shield. When it was over, Ms. Ellis made a few more notes and nodded. The children seemed content, and there's no immediate sign of neglect. "But, Ms. Harper, I'll need documentation regarding your legal guardianship, schooling plans, and residency status." Emily's voice came quiet but steady. "We're not running. We're surviving." "I understand, ma'am, but without those documents, I may have to refer this case to our regional office." Jonas stepped forward. "They're not going anywhere." Ms. Ellis didn't look at him. "That decision isn't yours to make. Like hell it isn't." "I'll give you 1 week," she said, turning toward the door. "If you don't produce legal paperwork or alternative placement, I'll have no choice but to initiate proceedings." She left without saying goodbye. Jonas stood at the door long after the taillights vanished down the dirt road. Inside, the children were still quiet. Emily knelt beside Lottie, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Are they taking us?" the little girl asked. Emily didn't answer. Jonas turned around. His voice came out like gravel. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The next morning, Jonas hitched the truck and drove into town. He went straight to the courthouse, boots heavy on the marble floor. The clerk behind the counter blinked up at him. "I need paperwork, adoption forms, guardianship, whatever it takes." The clerk shuffled nervously. "You'll need to speak with Judge Harmon, and probably a lawyer." "Then I'll do that." That afternoon, he stood in the tiny courtroom, hat in hand, and told the judge everything. About the cabin, the children, Emily, the way they'd brought life back to the house, the way he hadn't realized he was dying until someone gave him a reason not to. Judge Harmon was a tired man with a soft voice and eyes that had seen too many broken families. He listened, he took notes, and at the end he said, "If you're serious, Mr. Carr, you'll need to prove stability, and you'll need her consent." Jonas nodded. "You'll have it." When he returned home, Emily was sitting on the porch with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. She didn't look at him as he sat beside her. "They'll come again," she said. "I know." "They'll take them." "No," he said. She turned. "You can't stop them." "I'll marry you." She blinked, stunned. "I'll adopt them," he continued. "Give them my name, give you all my land, if that's what it takes." She stared at him, the words hitting like stones in still water. "Jonas, I'm not asking out of pity. I'm not doing this to save you. I'm doing it because I've already lived the other life, the one without you, and it was empty and cold and dead. I'm not going back to that." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I'm not what your wife was," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to be." She looked out over the field, where the children were playing tag, laughter floating through the late spring air. "You really want this?" "I already have it," he said. "I just want to make sure no one can take it away." She covered her face with her hands, breath shaking. And then, for the first time, she leaned into him. Not because she was weak, but because for the first time, she didn't have to be strong alone. The sky was soft with early summer blue, cloudless and vast, stretching wide over the Carr ranch like a blessing waiting to be spoken. Dew still clung to the blades of grass, glittering like beads of light as the morning sun rose higher over the ridge. The barn doors stood open, letting in the day, and somewhere in the pasture, the horses snorted and shifted, ready to start their morning run. Inside the house, laughter rippled from the kitchen to the hallway. It was the kind of sound that hadn't existed here for almost 2 decades. The kind that echoed off the walls and wrapped around the furniture like a warm quilt. The kind that made the house feel alive. Emily stood by the sink, fastening the last button of Sadie's dress while Lottie clung to her leg, sucking her thumb with sleepy eyes. The boys were already outside, dressed in half-buttoned shirts, tugging on boots and arguing about who got to ride in the front of the wagon. Rufus circled them lazily, tail wagging and ears perked. Jonas adjusted the collar of his old wool jacket in front of the mirror and exhaled. He'd been through droughts, stampedes, bank threats, even a brush with pneumonia one winter, but nothing made his palms sweat, like the thought of standing in front of the town as a man about to change his life forever. He stepped into the hallway and saw Emily looking at herself in the mirror. She wasn't wearing white. She'd said she wouldn't, not out of protest, but because it didn't feel right. She chose a soft sky-blue dress that hugged her figure gently, its hem stitched with hand-mended care. Her hair, usually pulled back out of necessity, was down in soft waves that caught the light when she turned her head. She saw him and smiled. He'd never seen anything so steady and fragile all at once. "You ready?" he asked. Her smile faltered for just a second, replaced by something raw. "I don't know how to do this part, Jonas." He reached for her hand, warm and calloused, fingers wrapped with strength and scars. "Neither do I." The wagon rolled into town just after 10, dust rising behind it like a ribbon. Jonas sat on the bench beside Emily, holding the reins, while the children bounced and whispered excitedly in the back. Lottie had fallen asleep in Ben's lap. Sadie had a crown of wildflowers crooked on her head. Even Rufus had been washed and brushed and wore a red bandana Jonas found, buried in Martha's old trunk. The town was quiet when they arrived. A few folks stepped out of shops, pausing mid-task. Jonas saw familiar faces, some surprised, some curious, a few watching with veiled judgment. He felt it all, but none of it mattered. Inside the chapel, it was just Pastor Elias, the children, and a few pews dressed in dust. There were no flowers, no music, no procession, just the scent of old wood and sunlight filtering through stained glass. Elias smiled when they stepped inside. "You're both sure?" "We've been sure for a while," Jonas said. Emily stood with her chin high, but her hands trembled as they held her bouquet, just wildflowers the kids had picked from the creekside. Ben walked up beside Jonas, holding the small velvet box Jonas had handed him on the ride over. Sadie clutched Emily's dress, eyes wide. Pastor Elias began, voice low and gentle. The vows were simple. Jonas promised to keep her safe, to honor her strength, to raise her children as if they'd come from his own blood, to never again let silence be louder than love. Emily promised to stand beside him, to trust him, to share the weight, to make this house their home. Not his, not hers, but something born new between them. When the rings were on their fingers, and the words were spoken, and Elias gave them permission to kiss, they didn't rush. They stood a breath apart, eyes full, foreheads nearly touching. And then, quietly, tenderly, they kissed. The children erupted into claps and cheers. Outside the chapel, the town looked different. It hadn't changed, not really, but something had shifted. A few townsfolk approached. Mr. Granger from the feed store handed Jonas a wrapped parcel, jerky and honey biscuits. The widow Parker gave Emily a crocheted shawl and whispered, "You've got courage, dear," more than most of us ever had. Even Clara Mayfield, standing at a distance with tight lips, gave a small nod and turned away without a word. That night, back at the ranch, Jonas built a fire pit in the field. The children ran barefoot through the grass. Emily spread out an old quilt and leaned against his shoulder as flames flickered into the night sky. "I never thought it would feel like this," she said. "Like what?" "Like we belong." He looked out at the land, at the house with windows glowing, at the barn where someone had hung a string of paper lanterns Sadie made from scraps and glue. "You do," he said. "All of you." The paperwork came a week later. Clean. Final. The judge's signature scrawled at the bottom of the adoption forms. Ben Carr, Sadie Carr, Lottie Carr, and 3 more signatures. That sealed a promise. On the morning Jonas officially became a father to 6 children who hadn't known what safety felt like before him, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched them chase Rufus through the dew-wet grass. Emily came out, hair in a loose braid, smile soft and sleepy. "They're gonna break that dog's spirit," she said. "He's already broken, he just doesn't know it." They laughed, and the wind carried it across the fields like an old prayer finally answered. Later that summer, a new sign went up at the front gate. It didn't say Carr Ranch anymore. It said Carr and Harper Family Ranch, and underneath it, hand-painted by Sadie herself, in bold, uneven letters, "All are welcome here." Jonas stood under the sign the day it went up, Emily beside him, the sun warming their backs. The children circled like wild stars, and the land stretched endlessly before them. Not just his land anymore, theirs. Home, at last. In the silence of the plains, where a lonely man once lived only with the echoes of his past, love returned. Not with fanfare, but in the quiet resilience of a mother, the laughter of children, and the steady beat of hearts choosing to stay. What began as a job to clean a barn became the healing of two lives, the building of a home, and the creation of a family that rose from dust, determination, and grace. In the wild and wide American West, even the loneliest rancher can find love, if he dares to open his door. If stories like this one stir your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every tale is woven with grit, hope, and the kind of love that defies the hardest winds. Tap that bell icon so you never miss a new story from the frontier of the human soul. More powerful journeys are riding your way soon, so saddle up and stay with us.